fascism, you could also say corporatism, the kind of corporatist, the kind of German military-industrial complex, which emerged and with the collaboration of many plutocrats and oligarchs from the United States, Britain, France, and other countries, many of which were in the so-called Allies. And so this becomes very interesting. Professor Hall's obviously fascinated with this because he deals with it very well. So, so just reiterating, I'm just going through what I've sort of highlighted here. So I think Professor Hall gives a very good definition of communism in because he's giving a grand narrative. So maybe when you're doing this, you only have like a paragraph to just define communism. He's not writing a book about communism. He's just in passing telling the reader what it is. And I believe his intention is that this book is kind of encyclopedic, that some, a high school student or a university student or a retired person can pick this up and flick through the index, which is about yay thick, and can identify certain topics of interest and look them up. And so his definition of communism, he says, in the communist scheme of ideology and politics, the main engine of historical change lies in the material conflict among various classes of humanity. The essential element of class conflict is rooted in the human quest to control, manipulate, and own increasingly intricate assemblages of natural and manufactured environments. The competition entailed in the drive to transform Earth into property has divided humanity between slaves and slave owners, tenants and landlords, laborers and capitalists, colonizers and the colonized. For communists, therefore, the primary dynamo of historical transformation is the instability of material relationships linking human beings with one another and the rest of nature. Professor Hall goes in quite depth into how the United States responded to the threat of Marxist revolution to capitalism, and in particular to the United States, who was the kind of emerging and taking over from the British Empire as the world's kind of protagonist of this economic order, this political economy. And so Woodrow Wilson, for example, described Bolshevism as the very antithesis of everything that is American. So there you go. Already you had this kind of false dichotomy emerging, or maybe it wasn't a false dichotomy, but this kind of stark imagery that was emerging of us and them, communists and capitalists. And this is interesting because, of course, a lot of this was illusionary, and a lot of this was kind of constructed by competing elites in two parts of the world who kind of had an expansionist agenda, an imperialist agenda. The Soviet Union was just as much as an empire. I mean, people called it social imperialism and apologized for it, and to some extent that was true. I mean, they supported the Cuban Revolution, and it was a kind of, core and periphery status between Cuba and the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, both the United States and the Soviet Union did emerge in a kind of expansionist, colonialist way. And so Professor Hall's just giving the kind of preamble and the build-up here to the his more in-depth analysis of the Roosevelt and Hitler dichotomy, the two models of capitalism. And so, but one point that I think is very poignant, which Professor Hall emphasizes, he says that even though some Wall Street bankers were perfectly prepared to do business with the new Soviet regime, most committed anti-communists embraced the institution of American private property as a sacred bastion poised against the official atheism of Marxist ideology. He goes on, the insertion of the reference of God on the US money nicely encapsulates how the defense of capitalism from communism was primarily with the zeal of religious mission. So Professor Hall goes on, for example, the coming to power of fascist governments in Italy and Germany represented the right-wing extreme of capitalism's defense in Europe. The exercise of political influence by a number of social democratic parties, however, embodied more moderate approaches to the problem of countering the radical anti-capitalism of the far left. And so this is interesting. So we see how you have governments in countries like Italy and Germany embracing fascism, and really fascism, you hear this word kind of thrown around, but what is fascism? And Professor Hall deals with this in this chapter of his book. And on the other hand, you have, beneath the clash of empires, Hall states, and armies simmered the ideological disagreement whose effect was to pull social democracies away from from the uncompromising internationalism of Europe's more extreme socialists and communists. The Social Democrats let their nationalism prevail over their ideal of a borderless world founded on workers' solidarity. Instead of ascribing to Lenin's view of the war as a capitalist conspiracy cynically orchestrated by a nationalist tribe of war profiteers, the founders and early practitioners of social democracy joined the military campaigns of their own home governments. In doing so, they helped to locate the strategic fault lines between radicals and progressives. In distancing themselves from idealists and zealots of class-based revolution, the Social Democrats signalled their intent to restrict their politics to parliamentary means of reforming capitalist society from within. So this is very, very interesting, I believe. And so Professor Hall goes in quite depth and sort of gives in this section a historical analysis of how kind of the increased class consciousness of working people resonated within countries like the United States, Britain, and so on. And so you had, for example, he mentions that Ramsay MacDonald's Labour Party gets elected in the 1920s. You have kind of social democratic in Canada, the NDP, the New Democrat Party. Of course, in the United States, it was more ruthless crushing of any left-wing movements in the so-called Red Scare of 1919. And so you didn't have a kind of alternative social democratic force emerge to the left of the Democrat Party. And so that's also an interesting observation that Professor Hall makes. And so, however, you do have President Roosevelt emerge, this kind of interesting figure. And Professor Hall says the influence of Keynes and the Keynesianisms helped give cohesion to the design and implementation of President Roosevelt's New Deal. And so by adapting government finances to the goal of providing broader public access to education and healthcare, and by putting in place the rudimentary beginnings of social welfare systems, proponents of social democracy, the New Deal, and the Popular Front effectively defended the overarching culture and institutions of capitalism. They did so by making concessions to fend off the radical agendas of their more extreme opponents, whose goal it was to preempt various forms of market relations through the exercise of workers' rights and state-controlled central planning. And so, really what the Social Democrats were doing, right, they weren't wanting to destroy capitalism, as I'll reiterate. They wanted to save capitalism by placating the working class. Professor Hall also provides an interesting illustration of how trade unionism manifested itself in the United States, and how you had these two unions emerge, a kind of left-wing revolutionary trade union known as the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies for short, or in abbreviation. And you also had the Federation of Labour, which was a right-wing union, and of course, you know, you had what became known as nativism, ironically, right, because you had these European migrants then claiming to be the natives, right? And this right-wing union, the American Federation of Labour, were, for example, hostile to the integration of blacks into the labour force. And it's quite interesting from my point of view. You know, I find very interesting the how capitalists obviously want blacks, whites of all ethnicities and backgrounds, East Indian people from all around the world to kind of come together in one working force for the simple reason it pushes down wages because there's a surplus of labour. And it's also more difficult to trade unionize when you have a multicultural workforce. So while multiculturalism is obviously on the surface a progressive cause, often it does it's very conducive to class exploitation, class warfare by the capitalist class. And of course, so you had this kind of right-wing union who were rejecting that, and you had a left-wing union who believed in workers' internationalism, as I would support, of course. And so this is an interesting part of this initial section of the chapter of this book, Earth and Property. And so so Professor Hall goes into how you kind of had these two unions, and obviously those in power would support the right-wing union, generally speaking, because they were kind of they weren't revolutionaries. They wanted to work within the framework of capitalism and just really wanted to work for the interest of white workers. And so you kind of obviously have different factions who some, of course, would still want the kind of the flooding of the labour market.